Golden Witch, the VOIDGAZERS.
Follow me into the void, not to typically avoid. Feelings that you paranoid, opinion you would do enjoy to bury. We carry all your memories and remix your ancestors. Past the future, have a melt in your mouth texture.
Cheese bread, take your head. Just rush the bed, dodge the fence. A virus spreads, you're not safe, so take the pill. Everyone can see you on the hill, so come into the void.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to a podcast with the Golden Witch, myself, joined by Mint Salad.
Hello.
And we have a very special guest. Would you introduce yourself?
Hello, I am JD, the gay autistic Mormon Marine. I am an aspiring YouTuber with a bachelor's from Columbia University in psychology, focusing on mental health and a concentration in sociology. And I'm happy to be here.
We are happy to have you.
I feel like because of the growing awareness for autism, and because more and more people are recognizing it in themselves, and to a lesser extent because the DSM kind of conflated all different kinds of autism into this larger spectrum, people don't realize there's a lot more variability and even like lack of consensus, disagreement within the community.
That's a good way of putting it. I always worry that like maybe these people's don't have, like, 'cause it's often people who are in therapy who have the biggest problem, where like they have been told something very helpful to them by their therapist about their autism, but they're sort of projecting it that like that's how autism is in all cases. And so you brought up something that made me interested in the idea that autism is a spectrum. It's many different things. It's not just one thing. So like in your like studies, how many different types of autism are like confirmed currently, I guess?
Everyone has their own exposure and their own experience with autism. I got my diagnosis when the DSM-4 had been upgraded to the DSM-5. And so I understood like autism as the more extreme behavioral issues. And I was actually diagnosed with Asperger's. But because of a long list of complicated issues, like Asperger's didn't exist anymore, and it was all just autism spectrum. I want to recognize that everyone's individual experience is going to be different, and everyone's individual symptoms are different, and therapy is complicated.
Yeah. Therapy
was very helpful for me because I was already very high functioning. And I also understand some people take a lot of offense with the phrase high functioning, but I'm going to use it here just because it's the most practical. Because I was functioning well enough that I had problems, but I could kind of navigate society. Therapy was really helpful because it basically explained what was wrong with me and I could adjust to it. It was ultimately not helpful enough, however.
Like you were saying that everyone has their own experience, everyone has their own symptoms, and that's a very important thing to always remember because, again, autism is a spectrum, and like you said, you were labeled as Asperger's at the time, the understanding of it has kept changing, and like those are already the hardest things for autistic people to understand, is that like what the difference in perspective is between ourselves and other people, as well as like constantly updating information, like just kind of getting stuck in information that already exists. So I bring this up because it's something that I have to deal with as somebody who talks about autism in sort of a gonzo way, where if what I say isn't exactly the same as what a certain person's therapist said, they might be like, well, my therapist said this. And it's like, yeah, go to 4 more therapists and see what all of them say, because they're all going to give you different answers,
It's interesting to me how people turn psychology into this monolith, even though it's like incredibly complex and it's so inconsistent, and it's been so not controversial, just like this isn't like physics where there's test. Psychology is an effort from like top down, like seeing different people behave kind of similarly in like a kind of pathological way and trying to figure out how they're actually similar when they may not actually be. You get your diagnosis, you're being told by like a specific therapist with a specific kind of training from a specific generation of psychology with a specific understanding that may be decades out of date, that may be from a methodology that is, or will be from a specific methodology that may not be the same as other people's perspective. And like even little things like, in 1 year, I went from Asperger's to autism spectrum disorder, and that completely changed, or was intended to completely change, my perspective of my mental disorder with myself. But that's not what my individual experience is. And you do run into that problem where I think it's really important for people to recognize that psychology is not as monolithic as other hard sciences. Autism is not a concrete idea. It is not a like specific abnormality in the brain. It's not a very well diagnosed thing. It's an idea that we have categorized and we have built a concept and a construct around. And especially people who are initially exposed to a concept are going to really hard attach to it, especially if they're younger, because that's just how the younger brain works. And they're not willing to recognize the variability or just the lack of consensus in this field.
I was diagnosed with Asperger's, but it was not Asperger's. I was described as being very high functioning. I related a lot to you when you said it just you could fit in society, but when you got the label, you're like, oh, it clicks. Explains everything that was I perceived as wrong with me.
Watched some of your videos before and listened to some of the VOIDGAZER podcasts. To me, there's no question that all three of us are some degree of autistic, and would be diagnosed with autism. At the same time, it really just comes down to how good your therapist is or whether or not they think that it would be beneficial to you. And in the case of where Mint was, what Mint had mentioned, where I feel there's something wrong with me, and to finally have a label for that was really cathartic for my personal sense. But my therapist wasn't really interested in even giving me that diagnosis. I had to really push her to be like, dude, there's something wrong with me, and I just want a fucking name for it. And then she was like, well, I've known you were autistic from the first time that you came in here. I just didn't tell you because I didn't think it would be beneficial to you. And it's these kinds of dynamics of you have professionals, you have a whole historicity of psychology going back 150 years. And, there's so many variables. And I think that's, to come back to something we were discussing before, I think that's where a lot of people have problems with being charitable to other people, where they just don't understand it's not a monolith. It has a huge history. That history is steeped with complicated SJW issues like racism and sexism. Some myths still exist that people just cling to, like the idea that they're gendered brains and that the Stanford jail experiment proved something. It's a really complicated issue that's only more complicated by popular interpretation of it. This is kind of a component of, I think, what the intention was behind the video where we're talking about the cultural model of interpretation. The cultural perception of things like bipolar and schizophrenia are so negative, and you're not even I also have a really close friend who is bipolar, and I've seen his mania, and I understand the aspects that are maladaptive, for lack of a better word, but he can be so productive and he is so happy, and there are so many positive elements to the mania, but it's so pathologized and negative. It becomes a controversial statement to say I like it when I'm in my mania, and I think that is a component of that cultural model where it's where there's stigmas and all these other elements that precludes us from having an honest conversation about our experiences. Knee-jerk reaction that people had to the last video, and the knee-jerk reactions that people will have in general, is probably some of it is going to be inevitable, just because someone is going to be triggered no matter what. And being cautiously compassionate is the key to being as kind about this as you can be. So what I would recommend you do is that next time that you do talk about this, try to have some piece in the beginning that does talk about the historicity of psychology, that does kind of talk about, this is a relatively young field that, and it's full of inconsistency and controversy.
Yeah.
Like we've had a replication study crisis where a lot of the things that we just took for granted over the last couple of decades have been proven possibly to be untrue. There's a lot of myths and a lot of fake studies that people believe are true that, just perpetuate because there isn't a good discourse about it. And there's the interesting thing about the cultural mode of interpretation is that it's a different method. It's a different modality of interpreting mental illness. And there's other kinds of radical, for lack of a better word, interpretations like like RDoC. I don't know if you're familiar with RDoC.
I'm not.
RDoC is research domain criteria. It says nothing about what it is. How psychology has worked so far is that you take people with a particular behavior and you study them as a category, assuming that they're the same type of person. That's how the DSM operates, is that you have all these people who have a similar pathology and you assume that they're the same type. And, there have been 5 iterations of it. They've been changing. But for the most part, we have an idea of like, this type of behavior we call autism. This type of behavior we call PTSD now. This type of behavior we call schizophrenia, and this is bipolar. What RDoC does is it wants to flip it, and it's going to focus on the brain first. And it's going to look at the activities of the brain and see what spurs up from that, what is responsible for these kinds of behaviors, what's responsible for these kinds of development. And it's a completely different modality of interpreting psychology, where it starts with the organ of the brain itself and then tries to understand it. And I think if you contextualize just how complex and how difficult it even is to talk about it, that will alleviate a lot of knee-jerk reactions to, you're not explaining or you're not expressing my personal experience and I'm offended. That's not what autism is to me.
We don't have a full understanding of psychology, and we don't have enough people studying it, or like the means to allow enough people to study it. Like, to go back to like that sort of discussion we were having about how I think like being an entertainer like me might not even be as valuable as like blue collar work and things like that. There's a certain amount of that type of work that we need for a society to even function. We can't have everyone study psychology and know about it, or even enough people to help all the other people at like the point we're at right now. Like, there's a lot of just realities. Like you said, it would be a very ideal world if everybody had all the types of therapy they need, but it's just not available, like we don't have enough means to have enough psychiatrists to help enough people. So like, as much as I wish everyone could get the help they need, I also think like I'm not going to say like you are responsible to take care of yourself, because I don't think you like have to if you don't have to. But if you want to survive better, taking matters into your own hands will be very helpful, because we don't live in that ideal world,
It's language is hard and word choice is difficult. And I think the core of what we ultimately want to say is that we do have genuine good intentions, and we simultaneously want people to be empowered to know that they have a potential for future, the capacity to do things, and to be more than whatever pain may be in their world. And at the same time, we don't want to invalidate that. We want to be compassionate about that pain. We recognize it, we empathize with it, and we support you through struggling with it. And we both want to support your lived experience while encouraging and enabling you to achieve and be healthier and happier than you are now, no matter how happy and healthy you are now.
All right, well, I can't thank you enough for coming on here and talking about this. This is a very like both enlightening and I think important discussion for a lot of people in my audience need to hear the stuff we talked about. So I'm really glad you came in here to talk about it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a great experience.
fun to bounce ideas off of. I'll definitely talk to you again. That's it. Goodbye, everybody who's listening. Make sure you support Yig Studio on onlyfans.com/YGGstudio. You can find my writing personally on goldenwitch.substack.com. Do you have anything you want to plug while we're here?
Yes, but there's no content on it, so I don't know if that's a good
Go for
idea.
it anyways. Just plug whatever you want to plug.
I have a very, very nascent channel called Gay Autistic Mormon Marine on YouTube. I only have one video. I'm starting off with analyzing League of Legends characters because it's a fun medium to do so, but I intend to do more complex analysis of more complex concepts, from everything to media analysis to interesting talks like these. So
I don't know how I could possibly not be subscribed to a channel called Gay Autistic Mormon Marine, so I'll definitely be subscribed to that.
the first video is terrible. I'm literally learning to do literally everything by myself. So compassion, please. But
pretend it's not terrible and tell everyone to go watch.
I'm going to pretend like it's not terrible, and I am advising you to go watch.
Amazing. All right, man. Thanks again for coming out. See you later, everybody. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and bye.
Thanks for watching another Yig Studio movie. Our crew is always on the go, so we're always leading up to some kind of event. The next place you can catch us is at the show on screen right now. So check it out if you want to see what we've got going on in person.